book Caesar's Messiah shows that the Gospels were written by a family of Roman Caesars called the Flavians. They created the Gospels as a political tool. They wanted to create a different version of Messianic Judaism. They had fought against a Messianic movement in Judea that was obviously militaristic and violently opposed to Roman rule. So the Gospels were created to replace that version of Messianic Judaism. The reason that the Romans wanted to create their own Savior Messiah is because they wanted to have a pacifistic Christ. The Christ that they were fighting against was a military Messiah. The storyline of Jesus is fiction. It was based upon a military campaign of a Roman Caesar named Titus Falvius. The reason that people have not recognized that the character Jesus Christ is fiction is simply because they haven't understood the genre that the Gospels were written in. The Gospels are in fact a Roman mockery of a kind of literature that the Jews produced in the first century. And this type of literature is referred to as typology. Typology is simply basing one character upon another, and it is found throughout Hebraic literature in the Old Testament to link one prophet to another prophet. At the very first page of the book of Matthew, the author has created a primer, a small example of the typology that's going to extend throughout all of the works. And what Matthew has done is he has taken stories from the Old Testament and placed them into his story of the pre-ministry of Jesus. He has taken names, locations, and concepts from the Old Testament, and he has woven them into his story about Jesus Christ. And he has placed them in the same sequence, so that when you compare one story to the other, the Old Testament with the New Testament, you can see that Moses was connected very directly to the character that Matthew is writing about, Jesus Christ. The reason that Moses was chosen as the archetype of Jesus is because he was the first Savior of Israel. And so by connecting him directly to that particular Hebraic prophet, you show that Jesus Christ is also a Savior of Israel. And what's interesting is that this shows that the character Jesus Christ is fiction. The events in his life are not original historical episodes. They were simply taken from another book. Now, the same thing is true about the entire rest of Jesus' ministry. It is all taken from another book. So I'm going to present an outline, an abbreviated version of what I have named the Flavian signature in the Gospels. And this is essentially the typologic connections between the ministry of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus Falvius. Now, these connections occur on the side of Jesus Christ. Of course, we find them in the Gospels. The military campaign of Titus Falvius was written by his historian Flavius Josephus. And so I will be showing these connections between the Gospels and the Flavian history of the military campaign. Get the online versions of both the Gospels and of Whiston's translation of Josephus so that you can actually go step by step. You can repeat every single connection that I am making here, and you will be able to see for yourself this amazing relationship between Josephus and the Gospel. And I am confident that you'll recognize that this was obviously deliberate. And this will become particularly clear when I get to certain areas in the Gospels that have what I call almost a virtual literary barcode, so that you can see that these very unusual events are occurring in both stories, and they're occurring in the same sequence. It begins at the same location for both of these individuals, the Sea of Galilee. At the Sea of Galilee, Jesus comes and tells his disciples that from now on, if you follow me, you will catch men. Now, this is mirrored by the experience that Titus Falvius has, where he comes to the Sea of Galilee. His men go out into the sea to attempt to destroy the Jews who are in their fishing boats. The boats are sunk, the Jews attempt to swim to safety, and the Romans catch them like fish. The typology that Matthew had used ends directly before this episode in Matthew. You can see that, you have the typology that links Jesus to Moses, and then just a few lines later, suddenly here you have this odd parallel between Jesus and Titus. And this is really quite strange, that given that the beginning of Matthew is all of this typology, and this is something that scholars do not dispute, that the connection between Jesus and Moses was deliberately created. But here you have a parallel that's just as good as the ones we saw in the story between Jesus and Moses, and yet no one has ever asked this obvious question. It's the same location, it's at the beginning of the ministries of both of these individuals, and you do have this very odd parallel concept of fishing for men. So, having made this simple step of just asking the question, is it possible that these events were deliberately wired together as we had seen occurred in the events that led directly up to it? Just asking that simple question is all anyone needs to do to enter into the most profound archaeologic discovery in Western civilization. That simple step takes us right into the Flavian signature. Once you start to recognize and believe that these stories, the story of Jesus and the military campaign of Titus Falvius, once you recognize that they were wired together, you can read in a different way. You can read with that strong bias, and these parallels will start to pop out. Now, where does the bias come from? As we go through this, you'll see that there are many parallels which are absolutely crystal clear, and they form a kind of foundation from which everything else can be seen. So as I go through it, I'll point out to you the first parallel, and this is something that frankly just baffles me, is that the journeys are the same. And I'm going to describe it now so we won't have to go into it in too much detail later on. But the fact is, you start out in Galilee, at the Sea of Galilee. You then go out into the Galilean countryside. Then at a certain point, Jesus declares that he's going to go on to Jerusalem. He takes the journey, but when he gets to the city, he doesn't go directly in. He stays outside the city for a while. He then has a triumphal entrance into Jerusalem, and then the story of Jesus takes you outside of the city again for the crucifixion. Well, this is the exact journey that Titus takes. Now, this in and of itself is perhaps not overwhelmingly strong evidence that the two stories were deliberately connected, but it is suspicious. It rises to the level of suspicion and curiosity. Why are they exactly the same? I mean, for example, why does Jesus wait for a period of time before he goes into Jerusalem? What's the point of that? When you look at the storyline of Jesus' ministry, it is mysterious. I mean, why does he go to these particular places in this sequence? Why does he stop? But once you start to question, was this done because the author is wiring Jesus directly into the story of Titus, then you start to have this bias that I talked about. So that's the first point I want to make, is that the actual locations are exactly the same. And this, of course, mirrors the typology that I talked about previously. The typology that connected Jesus to Moses had the same physical journey. So that this is why it is so interesting that Jesus and Titus have the same physical journey, and it requires of an alert reader. It isn't really just a supposition on my part. I think it's a requirement of every scholar and every person that wants to know the truth about the Gospels, is to ask the question, was the geography, was the journey created to mirror that of Titus Flavius's? All right, so I'm going to just go through some of the stories that are parallel, that were wired. I'm not going to go into any detail, but I'm just going to describe them so that people can, at their leisure, read them carefully and make a connection. You then have a strange story in both Josephus's tale of Titus's military campaign and the Gospels, where you have to keep holy the Sabbath by restoring a right hand. Then you have the story of the demon of Gadara. And just immediately before that, you have a tale of John who's possessed by a demon. As you go through the story of the demons of Gadara, you'll see that it is an exact parallel to the battle of Gadara that Titus had, where you even have you can actually lay what happens to the herd, where they rush to, how they drowned. The stories are very, very similar, and in fact, the parallels between the tales have been covered by many scholars. After Gadara, you have the identification of the Christ. Happens in both stories at the same place. Following the identification of the Christ, you have descriptions of binding and loosening, little stories which describe both binding and loosening. And these are very, very important parallels and have been seen by other scholars, but they have not bothered to place them into the sequence. After the time in the Galilean countryside, you now have a point of decision where Titus decides to go on to Jerusalem, and he sends his troops ahead of him, a certain group of them, to meet him there. Jesus has the exact same event. He decides suddenly that he has to go on to Jerusalem, and the Gospels say he sends his messengers ahead. The Good Samaritan is just a fascinating piece of typology. The story in the Gospels describes someone who's he's on the road to Samaria. He's grabbed by a group of robbers. They steal his mule. They beat him up. And at this point in the campaign of Titus Flavius, he appears with the 12th Legion. And Josephus recounts how well they have been refurbished. The 12th Legion was attacked by a group of Jewish rebels on the road. They stole their mules and stripped them of their clothes and goods. Titus, who is described as coming through Samaria, has refurbished the legion and now is walking with them to Jerusalem. So Titus, the story of the Good Samaritan, which there have been so many things written about as to what it means and what exactly Jesus is talking about, is actually just a representation of Titus refurbishing a legion that had had its mule stolen from it, and then going forward to wage war against the Jews. Now you get outside Jerusalem. Both of these individuals come out to outside Jerusalem. And they pause. Now, in Titus's case, it's because he needs to organize his triumphant entrance into the city. And The same is true in Jesus, though we don't exactly know why he can't just walk in at this particular point, but he doesn't. He stays outside and he has these events. And when you compare the events between Jesus and Titus as they are outside of Jerusalem, you can really start to see some of the connections becoming very, very clear. Jesus talks about knocking on the door. He talks about the authors of the Gospels talk about how the Jews are trying to lay traps for him. They talk about the Jews increasing in number, surrounding Jesus. I mean, these are all obviously, related to the campaign that Titus is waging. And you can see this when you actually put the experiences right next to each other. That Jesus and Titus are both essentially having these battles with Jews directly outside of Jerusalem. And when you compare them in their sequence, you can see that this event of Jesus, the events that occurred to him as he was outside Jerusalem, are definitely all simply were based upon what is happening to Titus as his military campaign goes forward. I wanted to go through a few of the parallels in a little more depth because what I'm presenting here is a barcode. In other words, this is a connection between Titus's military campaign and Jesus's ministry that is so direct and so transparent that it's really indisputable. There really isn't any way that this connection that I'm going to show you could have been accidentally created. It wasn't just the people writing the Gospels who were looking for interesting stories to put into their character of Jesus. This is clearly proof. These events, when you lay them on top of one another and you compare, the parallels, are absolutely clear evidence that Jesus is a fictional character whose story is based upon Titus Flavius. So the first of these parallels I call the woe saying Jesus. Now, in both Josephus and the Gospels, you have a character called Jesus who goes into a long litany of woes, uses the word woe over and over again. The character in Josephus has just so many connections to the character in the Gospels that many, many scholars have written about them. If you look in the internet, you'll see the woe saying Jesus in Josephus is, by hundreds of people, is claimed to have been based upon the character in the Gospels. What they haven't recognized is that when you look at the two storylines, that the woe saying Jesus appears at the same place in both tales. The character in Josephus, who is a woe saying Jesus, is an obvious representation of the character in the Gospels. Okay. He enters Jerusalem during a pilgrimage festival. He delivers a woe oracle against Jerusalem. He is seized by the leading citizens. Both Jesuses are beaten and later scourged. Neither one of them answers a direct question during the interrogation. They are both taken to the Roman procurator. They're called madmen, and the word is the same. It's a special Greek word. Both of them are referred to as madmen using this word. Both Jesuses prophesy their own death, and then both of them die. So you can see that this is very suspicious that there are all these direct connections between the character in Josephus, who also has the name of Jesus. But when you place this event in the overall storyline, then it really becomes dramatic. Then it becomes very, very difficult to say, wait a second, how could this possibly be? This is obviously typology. Some author is creating this character, Jesus Christ, in the gospel, and is using characters from Josephus to build him up. Following that event, you have a very distinct connection between the so-called innocents being beaten worse than the guilty. Very unusual concept, and in both cases it occurs immediately following the woe saying Jesus. Here we have a parallel that is simply impossible to ignore. It is so direct, and when it is placed in sequence, it becomes part of what I'm referring to as the barcode. And I'm actually going to read just a few lines so that people can hear with their ears exactly how profound these similarities are. Josephus wrote that the sedition had been divided into 3 factions, was now reduced to 2. At this point in the Gospels, Jesus is asked if he came to bring peace on earth. And he states, not at all, rather division. From now on, 5 in one house will be divided, 3 against 2 and 2 against 3. So notice that Jesus did not come to bring peace like Titus. The division in both cases is noted, and of course the 3 to 2. This parallel is very unusual, very, very complex, very unusual. All of these concepts swirling around, all of these different ideas, war, division, 3 for 2. And yet, when you place it in context, it becomes even more vivid, stronger. Now, a trivial parallel, but a very perfect one. Jesus predicts that a fruit tree should be cut down if it doesn't bear good fruit. And Titus orders all of the fruit trees between the Roman camp and the city walls cut down. Jesus predicts that a fruit tree will be cut down. Titus orders the fruit tree to be cut down. You have a story where the Roman siege apparatus has given the Jews only a very narrow door. And Josephus then records the points of a compass that describe how this door has been shut. Jesus has a story that has these exact concepts. You have trivial parallels now about Jesus wondering, what is the best way to build a tower? But then if you look into Josephus, you'll see that, in fact, Titus is looking at that exact point for the best place to build a tower. Now, Jesus mentions the sending of a delegation to find peace. Titus sends a delegation to find peace. Okay, now we come to really the most interesting of all of the parallels in the Gospels. It's fascinating, just from the perspective of literary analysis, of how they actually were able to achieve this. Very innocuously in the Gospels, you have the triumphant entrance of Jesus. The people cry out, the Son is come. And then you have this bizarre story where Jesus is told to make these people quiet down. And he says, oh, no, if they were quiet, that the stones themselves would cry out. And then Jesus goes on and states that something has been blackened from your eyes, hidden from you, so you can't see it. It doesn't really make a lot of theological sense, but when you place that story in context with Josephus, it just comes to life. Because it is at this point that Josephus makes his famous mistake. Titus has his entrance into the city at this point. He fires a stone from a catapult, and it goes right into the city. The Jews have a watchman who cries out when he sees the stone coming. But Josephus wrote that the watchman didn't say, a stone is coming. Josephus made a mistake, supposedly. He wrote, the watchman cried out, the Son cometh. So this, in context, again, is amazing. Many people have tried different ways to get around Josephus's mistake. In fact, a lot of them. And that's one of the reasons why you need to use the Whiston translation, because it's very, very literal. Many modern translators simply just mistranslate it. They say, they have the watchman stating, the stone is coming. But what Josephus wrote was, the Son cometh. And then in the next line, Josephus actually has the stone crying out. And Whiston very faithfully translates, very precisely. It is only, that's why I recommend using Whiston, because he's so literal. You can see it actually in the text. The stone cries out. This is followed then by a description of the Romans being aware that the Jews can see the stone, and so they blacken it. They hide it from their eyes. When you place these concepts on top of one another and next to one another, it is absolutely transparent. This is directly wiring one story into the other. There is no way, absolutely no way, that Josephus would make the only real error in grammar he makes is an entire book at the exact point in the storyline that the Son cometh in the Gospels. This is beyond impossible. This did not happen. These stories are wired for sound. And now we can actually prove it. We can go into real proof, because following the Son cometh, we now have parallels which are not conceptual, but they are the same thing. Jesus predicts that Jerusalem will be encircled with a wall. Titus encircles Jerusalem with a wall. There is no ambiguity here at all. This is literally the same thing, and yet it is occurring at exactly the correct point in time. Now, in the Gospels, Jesus at this point drives out the thieves from the area in front of the temple. This famous story of Jesus driving out the polluters of the temple area. At this point in the storyline in Josephus, Titus gets control of the area in front of the temple. And he refers to the group that he's driving out with the same Greek word, which indicates that they are robbers or thieves, the same word that Jesus used to describe them. Now we're going to come to the final point in what I call the barcode. Jesus predicts that the abomination of desolation, which is an event that Daniel predicted, actually, will come to pass. And Josephus records that, in fact, the abomination of desolation occurred at this exact point. So when you then look back at this collection of events, when you go to the fruit tree, when you look at the Son cometh, when you then see the stone crying out, and the things which cannot be disputed, the encircling of the wall, the encircling of the city with the wall, the driving of the thieves and robbers away from the area directly in front of the temple, and then the abomination of desolation. It's simply impossible. These are very, very unique concepts. There are not a dozen books that even describe these concepts. The abomination of desolation, the encircling of Jerusalem with a wall. These are very, very unusual concepts. They could not occur in the same sequence accidentally. This is really important for our culture, to understand where Christianity came from. And this is direct evidence. You can actually walk this path and come to this conclusion. You can know that Christianity was an invention of the Romans. It was done to pacify their subjects. And this is important because it gives us a different way of understanding government, how government operates, the tools that government uses, the purpose that government has for the various propaganda apparatus. I think it's a requirement of alert citizens to know how the Gospels were written, why they were written, who produced them, what was the purpose in back of all this. This is good citizenry. Everyone should be involved in this. Everyone should be looking at this, reading it, and coming and recognizing that this was where the Gospels originated. The Gospels came from the Flavian imperial court. All right, so I'm not going to go into the final parallels because you can simply buy the book if you want to gain insights into these. But you will see that in both Josephus and in the Gospels, you have a human Passover lamb, a Last Supper, where the Son of Mary becomes a human Passover lamb. You have a crucifixion of a group of three, where one survives, and that Joseph of Arimathea, or in Josephus' story, Joseph Bar Mathia, takes them down from the cross. And then the conclusion of the Gospels is the prophecy that Jesus makes concerning Simon and John, that Simon will be taken where he doesn't want to go, bound and given to death to glorify God, and John will be spared. At the conclusion of Josephus, the rebel leaders, Simon and John, are captured. John is given perpetual imprisonment, and Simon's experience is an exact parallel an exact fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus gave. So, that is the Flavian signature.